Hello and welcome back to video classes by Konnur English Medium School. We will today pick up the next lesson, which is Louis Pasteur, Conqueror of Disease. This is prose unit number 4. Right. So Louis Pasteur, you all have heard about him, was one of the greatest scientists that the world has seen. So what did he do? He was experimenting during his time about the microorganisms that cause a disease. That is why the title Louis Pasteur, Conqueror of Disease. He was experimenting with all these germs, microorganisms that bring disease to living beings. And because of his discoveries, because of his inventions, because of all the experiments that he conducted, he is called the Conqueror of Disease. His contribution to the medical science is immense. So this is an essay written by E.H. Carter in an article called Pioneers of the Modern World. So that is the source of this article, this essay. Now, this is also kind of a biography of Louis Pasteur, but it's not really a biography in the perfect sense because it doesn't mention everything about him. It just gives us, a kind of portrait of this scientist, this great man. So it's a wonderful article. Let's go ahead and read it, and then, of course, I want you to pay a lot of attention to the details mentioned here. There is some science involved in this essay, right? We are going to talk about diseases, we are going to talk about pathogens, we are going to talk about infections, we are going to talk about vaccines. We are going to also talk about some of the experiments, scientific experiments that Louis Pasteur conducted during his days. Right. On the field of battle in one of his campaigns, Napoleon decorated for bravery a certain tanner named Pasteur. So Napoleon, the great French emperor, yes, you've heard about him, I am sure. Napoleon had an army in which he had, some very special brave soldiers, and he made sure that they were all given proper recognition. So it happens even in modern governments. Governments recognize brave army staff, and then they give them medals and awards, right? So Napoleon did that too in his time. There was this one man called Pasteur whom he decorated for bravery. Decorating is nothing but giving medals to a warrior, to a soldier. So they give medals, certificates, or some other such token that represent appreciation of that person's contribution, his bravery. So he decorated a tanner named Pasteur. So who is a tanner? A tanner is a leather merchant, a person who works with the leather, who prepares leather, who sells leather. So this Pasteur was not just a soldier, but he also had another profession, which was working with the leather. So in those days, people, conducted some business, or they were involved in some profession, but they also took part in battles and wars when it was necessary. So this tanner named Pasteur impressed Napoleon, and he received some, recognition, some medals for his bravery. This brave soldier had an equally brave son, Louis Pasteur, born 7 years after Waterloo. So this Pasteur that Napoleon recognized for bravery had a son, and he was none other than Louis Pasteur himself. So the word Pasteur in the first line refers to Louis Pasteur's father, who was a soldier in Napoleon's army. So Louis Pasteur's father was a brave man. He was recognized for that. He was recognized for his bravery. But Louis Pasteur, his son, he was also brave, says E.H. Carter. He was equally brave, just as his father. And Louis Pasteur was born 7 years after this great battle called Waterloo Battle came to an end. You can do a little bit of research on Waterloo Battle. You can find out why that battle was fought. by Napoleon, the French emperor. Now, Louis Pasteur was not a soldier, but he was a fighter. E.H. Carter says Louis Pasteur was brave like his father, but he was not a soldier. Now, you will be wondering, how can somebody be brave and not be a soldier? Well, bravery is not just something that you do in the battlefield, in the real battlefield. Bravery can, mean different things. Like it means for Louis Pasteur. Louis Pasteur was a fighter in a different sense. He was brave in a different sense. And that sets the perfect topic for the discussion of this essay. That is, how Louis Pasteur became to be known as a fighter. Why is he called a conqueror of disease? That's what we are going to read further. Now, he fought diseases. He was brave because he fought diseases. Now, when we say he fought diseases, are we talking about diseases that affected Louis Pasteur? No, we are not talking about that. When we say he fought diseases, we are talking about diseases that were affecting people in general. So he was not fighting diseases that affected him. He was fighting diseases in the sense that he wanted to know why those diseases were being caused and what was the possible remedy or cure for those diseases that people were suffering from. He devoted his life to the study of what we sometimes call germs, which men of science call bacteria, which is actually a Greek word meaning little rods. Now, I want you to remember that we are talking about Louis Pasteur, not the Tanner Pasteur, the soldier whom Napoleon decorated for bravery. We have shifted from that to Louis Pasteur now. We're talking about him. So Louis Pasteur was a fighter who fought against germs all his life. Germs, G-E-R-M-S. What is germs? Well, people of science, men of science, they refer to them as bacteria. So now you know what germs are. Germs are basically bacteria in the scientific terminology. And bacteria itself is a word that comes from a Greek root, a Greek source from Greek language. And it simply means little rod-shaped plants. So, well, bacteria are basically, in one sense, they are little rod-shaped plants. They are living beings, yes. So, some but not all are the causes of disease. Some convert matter into food for plants. Now, not all bacteria are bad, we know that already, yes. So, some bacteria are bad, and these bad bacteria cause disease, but the other bacteria, they are helpful in many processes of life. So we are talking about Louis Pasteur's fight against those bad bacteria, the disease-causing bacteria. Right, so Louis Pasteur had a very busy and interesting life. So his life was very busy. He was always engaged in some sort of intense activity, but it was also an interesting life to live. He not only made some exciting discoveries about germs, but he was also able to use his discovery in very practical ways. You know, scientists, they keep doing experiments, they keep discovering things, they keep making new pieces of knowledge available to others. Well, how much of this knowledge that scientists discover is practically applicable is important. You might discover something in a lab, but unless that discovery, that piece of knowledge is somewhere practically applicable, unless it is somewhere practically applicable, it's pretty much, a useless knowledge. Knowledge, of course, yes, but it would be useless unless you can use it somewhere practically. And all of discoveries of Louis Pasteur, everything that he did, everything he discovered in the labs through experiments, he could use that knowledge in practical ways. So in that sense, Louis Pasteur was a unique scientist. He did not discover something that was useless. Everything he discovered was practically usable, and he made sure that people benefited from those discoveries. He worked hard in his laboratory with the test tubes and all kinds of experiments, but nearly all the time he was working to help people who were suffering in some special way from disease. So although he spent a lot of his time every day in laboratories, in places where he had test tubes and other scientific equipment for experiment, he spent conducting experiments, had spent all the time conducting these experiments in labs, but what he was actually doing was, he was helping people who were suffering in some way from some disease. So all his experiments were aimed at helping people who were suffering. Now among the people whom Pasture was able to help were brewers, breeders of silkworm, and cow keepers, all of whom were trying to carry on important industries in France. Now in those days, in Pasteur's days, in France, of course, so he was in France, he lived in France, he was born in France, so he is a French scientist. In France, during his days, these were the important businesses, that is, brewing alcohol, beers particularly, and breeding silkworm and keeping cows. So many people were engaged in producing beer or wine, and many people were involved in silkworm profession, and some kept cows. So there were some cow keepers. So keeping silkworms, cow keeping, and brewing or distilling wine or beer were three important industries, you can say, or occupations during Pasteur's days. Now all of these were trying to carry these important industries in France. Pasteur was always very proud of being able to help the country in this way. So these three industries or these three occupations were suffering in some way because of certain diseases that was affecting their business. And guess what? Pasteur, with all his discoveries and experiments and relentless efforts in understanding how diseases are caused, was able to help these people. Which people? Brewers, breeders of silkworm, and cow keepers. Why? Because those were three important industries or occupations in France during those days. Well, how did Pasteur do that? Before we talked about Pasteur's discoveries in helping brewers and cow keepers and silkworm industries, we'll talk a little bit about Pasteur himself. Louis Pasteur was born in a little French country town, was interested in chemistry when he was very young. He was born in a little country town. A country town is a very small town, okay? It looks almost like a village. Country refers to rural, country has that meaning as well. So he was born in some rural background. He came from rural background. He didn't, grow up. He didn't grow up in some big city or town. But he was, as a young boy, he was very much interested in which subject? Chemistry. After studying hard in Paris and showing great promise, he began to teach and lecture as a professor of chemistry. Now, he showed great promise, means there was a lot of potential in him that his teachers, his lecturers recognized. They felt that this boy was going to become, a great man with knowledge in these scientific fields. So they understood that, they supported him, they helped him learn a lot of things. And very soon, Pasteur became a professor himself. He became a professor of what subject? Chemistry, of course. So he became a professor at Strasbourg in Alsace, and he married a wife who was always to be his closest companion and assistant. So he was made professor of chemistry in Strasbourg in Alsace. These places are in France, of course. There he became the professor of chemistry. And he found a lady and thought that she would be perfect for him as a wife. He fell in love with her. And she was later to become his greatest companion and assistant. She never complained about him sitting in laboratories all the time, experimenting with this or that, using test tubes, chemicals and all that. She never complained. Actually, she was very supportive of that. That's why he says he married a wife. E.H. Carter says he married a wife who was always to be his closest companion and an assistant. So she even supported him and helped him conduct those experiments. So he found a very good companion in life. Pasteur Pasteur was deeply interested in all the new experiments that were being made in chemistry, and decided to solve some of the difficult problems that were worrying chemists and other scientists. You see, when you are very passionate about some subject, when you are very passionate, deeply interested in a particular subject, you do not read just textbook, right? You want to find out more about that subject. You will look for other sources of information regarding that subject. And because Pasteur's passion was chemistry, he was interested in reading about all the experiments and discoveries that were going on around the world in the field of chemistry. So he always followed up what was happening around in the world of chemistry. Sometimes he used to sit for hours quite silent and emotionless, thinking hard about one of his difficulties. Now, many scientists were working on certain problems, certain issues, but they were not able to come up with solutions. They were not able to understand some things in chemistry. You see, chemistry today is very different from chemistry in those days. A lot of things in chemistry were not yet discovered, were not yet, understood properly. So we are talking about that period of time. So people were busy working on chemistry and then finding out things. And there were some things that were creating problems. They were posing great difficulty in understanding. And Louis Pasteur was not somebody who would wait for somebody to discover something. He himself spent a lot of time in labs trying to, crack that nut, trying to understand that difficult concept in the subject of chemistry. So he sat for hours, quite silent and motionless, thinking hard about one of the difficulties. What did he do? Did he just, all the time put chemicals into test tubes or some other thing and then, conducted experiments? No, sometimes he just sat for hours silently. He did not conduct experiments, but then he experimented with his own knowledge. He thought deeply about things that were creating difficulty for him to understand. He sat in one place, motionless, not moving, not talking, silently for hours together. And he thought very hard about something. You see, that is something you need to do, we all need to do if we really want to understand something. See, understanding is not always an easy task to accomplish, right? So, as kids you might sometimes give up, you try to understand something, it could be English, it could be science, mathematics, anything. You try, you don't understand it, and then you give up, you don't worry about that, right? But that is not how you understand. You have to sit down, think very hard about it. You have to employ what you already know and try to discover what you don't know. And great men like Louis Pasteur have done that all their lives. So he sat in one place, thought hard about the difficulties. He found this the easiest way to solve a problem. And when he thought of a solution, his kind, tired-looking face would brighten with pleasure and excitement, and he would rush around to tell this discovery to his wife and to others who were helping him. And nobody bothered him, nobody disturbed him when he was in that mood, when he was sitting and thinking deeply about some difficult thing in chemistry. And after some time, he would understand that concept, by just thinking hard about it. And then he, like a child, he would jump up and then run around the house and tell everybody that he found a solution to that difficulty, or he discovered, or he understood that concept. And everybody, his assistants, his wife, that shows how innocent he was. He never thought he was some great thinker or a great scientist. He was childlike and carried all the curiosities a child would have with it, And that shows the greatness of this man too. Well, there are more interesting things about Louis Pasteur coming up ahead in the next part of the lesson, which we will do in the next video class.